no numbers, there's no pictures, there's no videos, there's no gameplay. I don't like it.
Yo, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hope you guys are doing well. Hope everyone's having a good day so far. And today, Framers, we are back with another Free Realm Sunrise video. This time around, we're going to be continuing on with going behind the story of the Realm War. This is part 2. We're going to be going through chapter 6 all the way to chapter 10, I believe. I'm doing 5 chapters at a time because that is easier for me, so I don't blow out my voice, because yeah, these pipes, they need to stay safe. But regardless, if you guys missed the last video, go check it out. We went through the first 5 chapters. Now, what I want to start with by saying is there is a sort of, starting from this chapter, there's going to be a lot of character development for Dain that I just want to put out there. And it's going to be very important, trust me. It's probably going to be the biggest story for Dain. He's going to go through a lot. And I really, since we're going to be reading this, I do want to just state that the story here is going to get crazy. It will get crazy. There's kind of like with Luck of the Draw, there's a lot of build to the story. I mean, you need build if you're going to create a good story. And with Realm War, there is so much building going on. Like the actual, I would say the big parts of the story don't happen until the middle portion of the story, just because there is a lot going on. But yeah, we're gonna jump into the lore once again. But yeah, without further ado, let's just dive into it, man. There's a lot to go over here, so we're gonna move on to chapter 6, which is called chapter 6, Truth. Chugsy rummaged through his documents and found a page he had been looking for. He handed it to me and asked, "Do you know what this is?" I looked at the paper and said, "Sort of. We found pieces of this thing scattered in Black Forest, but it wasn't as colorful as this one." He looked at us and asked, "You went to the site of where they were. Why?" Maya grabbed the page and said, "Queen Valerian sent us there on a mission to retrieve this shard. We even saw them lying there on the battlefield, just lifeless." Chugsy stood there, speechless. He sat in his chair, then closed his eyes and breathed in heavily. Once he opened them, he looked at us and said, That shard you retrieved was once called the Gloamstone. As you know, they tried to protect the 4 shards from that dwarf, but they failed. Whatever reason Valerian had for sending you there, I will tell you this. She cannot be trusted." I looked down at the floor and said, "That's why we came here. She sent us to that graveyard without any answers of what happened there. Still, I've known Valerian for most of my life, and regardless of how she's acting, I still trust her." Chugsy looked at me and asked, "How well do you really know her?" I looked at Maya and said, "Well, I probably don't know everything about her, but it's not my job to watch her every move." He shook his head and said, "In a game of chess, every second on the board counts. If you miss even one move, the game is over, and in the end, you lose." Maya turned to him and asked, "Is there something you know about Valerian that we don't?" And context for that, if you read Samurai Stories, it's literally the second story in that whole thing. But basically, Chugsy finds out that Valerian took down the crystal barrier with something called a Gleamstone. And I wrote that in, I think I talked about it, but I wrote that in there because if there's a Gloamstone, there has to be a Gleamstone. Like, there has to be another artifact like the one Dark Cheat made. Like, there can't just be the one, you know? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me personally, but yeah, man, Chugsy basically found out that Valerian took down the crystal barrier with the Gleamstone, and he disapproved of the whole thing because it's what got Bryce and his friends killed. So, take that how you will, but that's kind of the story so far. Just to catch you guys up in case you have forgotten about Samurai Stories. But anywho, let's keep going. Chugsy walked back over to his desk, then sighed and said, I was ordered to visit Sanctuary and have a word with the Queen. When I talked with her, she told me how she really took down that crystal barrier in front of Silver Hills. She had something called the Gleamstone, which is the exact opposite of the Gloamstone that you two found in Black Forest. I turned to him and asked, if she already has a stone, why does she need the one we found? He shrugged and said, I'm sure we'll find out soon. I'm still trying to figure out what she's planning. He fumbled through his papers and his crystal, but he seemed frustrated. Maya flew up to him and said, we want to help. I stood up and asked, we do? Chugsy looked at us and said, I'll take all the help I can get, if you two are up to the task. Maya smiled and said, oh, believe me, we are. It's the entire reason we're here. I sighed and said, look, I want answers as much as the next guy, but I would like to know who this we is. Maya pulled me aside and said, Dane, you and I both want answers that Valerian won't give us. We should help him out and see where the road takes us. I nodded and said, I suppose that's a fair point. We deserve to know what's going on after all we've been through. I looked at Chugsy and asked, what do you need us to do? He smiled and said, I have more to do here, but that can wait. Follow me. We left his home and followed him deeper into the city. He led us to a building that we hadn't seen before. I turned to him and asked, this seems really far away from where we came in from. Why is that? Chugsy laughed and said, well, it wasn't my idea. Luthius prefers being out this far from the main city. Maya flew up to him and asked, who's Luthius? He smiled and said, our king. Chugsy opened the door and let us inside. I walked around the place and something about it felt familiar, like I had been here before. Maya turned to me and asked, is something wrong? I shook my head and said, it's probably nothing, but it could be deja vu. I'm wondering why he brought us here to see the King of Silver Hills. And context there, if you guys didn't read the end of Samurai Stories, that kind of leads into this, but basically in Luck of the Draw, there were 3 princes of Silver Hills that kind of ran things while the king was away. And I didn't write that in Luck of the Draw, but I did write it later on in Samurai Stories. And the king is the, like, there's a, I have in the Realm War, there's a lot of like medieval tie-ins and a lot of like royalty kind of bloodline type of stuff written in here. And I really liked writing those parts into this whole thing. But yeah, for context, the king is now back in Silver Hills, and there's more context on that, so stick around for that. But let's keep going. Maya thought for a moment and said, maybe the king has a plan and needs our help. Can't hurt to hear him out. I shrugged and said, I mean, we're just trying to understand what's going on, so I don't know how much help we could actually be. She smiled and said, you're more humbler than I remember. I think I'm starting to like this new Dane. I smiled and said, well, you better get used to it. He's here to stay. Chugsy, halfway up the stairs, turned to us and said, don't fall behind. It's important you both stay close. We both nodded and made our way up the stairs. It was easy to get lost in a place like this. When we reached the top of the staircase, I saw Chugsy approach a large throne. It was hard to make out who was sitting on the throne, but I knew why this all looked familiar. So, this whole, the whole dream that Dane had, it's going to play into this part a little bit. Well, not a little bit. It's going to play into it, but again, his dream has a lot more, like, there's more depth to it, and it's going to show more in, like, the later chapters, but we will eventually get to it. So, let's keep going. The dream I had was all coming back to me. I remember the dark corridor and the door covered in tree branches, but I haven't seen anything like that here. The throne, on the other hand, was right in front of me. Maya looked at me and asked, "Is something wrong?" I sighed and said, "I'm not sure, but keep your guard up." She nodded and we started walking towards the throne. Chugsy stopped us midway and said, "Give me just a moment to speak with the king." We both nodded and waited while he walked over to the throne. I started to observe them and Chugsy greeted him like an old friend. He turned to us and nodded, then we approached the throne. Chugsy cleared his throat and said, "Luthias, I'd like you to meet these two heroes from Sacred Grove." Luthias grinned and asked, "Chugsy has told me that you intend to help us. Is that true?" Maya nodded and said, "In any way we can." I was a little skeptical because of my dream, but I played along. Luthias stood up and said, "Please, tell me your names." Maya flew forward and said, "My name is Maya. I became a ninja when I was all alone." He stared at her and asked, "Do you have a last name?" She shook her head and asked, "No, I don't, but does it matter?" He sighed and said, "Lineage is very important to our kind. It is what defines our very legacy." I thought about my last name and realized that it was the last thing I heard, right as my dream ended. Luthias turned to me and asked, "What is your name?" I took a deep breath. I inhaled and exhaled and stared at him. I stood my ground and said, "My name is Dane. Dane Kensington III. I became a brawler when the world threw everything it could at me." His eyes widened and he asked, "Kensington?" Something stirred within me. It was like I was dreaming again, but this time it was a continuation of the dream I had before. So, probably in this chapter, Dane's character, like, development is gonna really happen, really settle in, and we'll talk about it, but in a way, this is like Dane's dream is continuing, like there is a continuation to it, and now we're gonna see the outcome of that dream and what it is kind of a prophetic dream, like a prophecy type of dream, but we're gonna keep going. I need to drink some water though before I die. Don't want to do that. Okay. He walked away from his throne. Then, oh my god, what the heck? Hold on, I usually shouldn't have to edit, but I don't know how I missed that. We're gonna view this entire thing. I shouldn't have to edit anything in this, but he walked away from his throne, then walked up to me and said, "Come with me. We have much to discuss." Not knowing how to react, I followed him to a large room that almost resembled a library in Sacred Grove. In the center of the room was another holographic crystal, like the one Chugsy had in his home. It was massive, like it had way more information on it. I looked at it and asked, I didn't get to ask Chugsy, but what is this thing? Luthias smiled and said, "This is where our entire history is stored. We call it the Everflow, to ensure that our legacy is preserved, even when we're gone." I sighed and said, "Speaking of legacy, what's so important about my last name? It's not like it holds any weight in Sacred Grove." He laughed and said, "Your last name may not hold weight there, but here it holds more than you could imagine." He pulled up an image of an elf on the Everflow and said, "Dion Kensington I, your grandfather." I took a step back from the Everflow to catch my breath. When I regained my composure, I asked, "What do you mean, my grandfather?" He laughed and said, "Exactly what I mean. Your bloodline started here, in Silver Hills. You, Dane, are an elf." Okay, so this is probably the biggest story revelation that a lot of you are going to be like, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. You'd be right to think that, but there's a lot about Dane's character that, like, again, he's so one-sided, and to me, Dane, I feel like there's more lore to him that the comics don't really bring up. Like, I don't know. To me, I wanted Dane to have more character development, and I thought that the name Kensington kind of had like a royal name to it, but I couldn't really piece it together, like if it would fit in well with this story. But the more I started writing the story, I was like, yeah, what if Dane was an elf? What if he really was like part of a bloodline? Like, again, there's a lot of royalty bloodlines in the story, and Dane being an elf is a part of that. Now, while Dane looks human in the comics, we're gonna go over it here, but Dane is like he's half human, half elf. And again, we're gonna dive into that a little bit more, but for the time being, just know that, like, again, this is important for Dane's character development going forward, because, well, it's not a huge it is a huge revelation. There's more about that storyline that I want to touch on, so let's keep going. I crossed my arms and said, "This doesn't make any sense. I don't even look like an elf, let alone remember being in Silver Hills." He smiled and said, "That I can explain. Diane was the right hand of my father before me. My father and mother had me, then Diane had a son and named him Dain. In time, Dain and I would be close friends, and he too would also be my right hand." He brought up another image on the Everflow, but for some reason I recognized his face. I cleared my throat and asked, "Is that who I think it is?" He nodded and said, "Yes, that's your father, Dain Kensington II, my closest friend and right hand of Silver Hills." I stared at the image and asked, "I still don't understand. How do I fit into all of this?" He sighed and turned off the Everflow, then said, "Your father started to grow distant. One day he wandered away from Silver Hills into Sacred Grove, and I followed him. He greeted everyone he ran into, and then he met a human female. I remember how they hit it off, and she would laugh at everything he said. Then he would do the same." I tilted my head and asked, "What happened next?" He shook his head and said, "I wish I could tell you. I never saw him again after that. I assume that he married her and they brought you into the realm." Hold on. Goodness gracious. I just saw something. There we go. Okay. Nothing huge, but let's go. "Now, while you look nothing like an elf, it's not what's on the outside, but what's on the inside that counts." I shook my head and said, You're saying I'm half elf on the inside and half human on the outside? There's no way that's true." So again, like, because so there Dane's character is really, you can't pinpoint his character. Like, his development is so bad in the comics, man, because Dane brings up he has a mom, and he brings up he has an uncle, brings up that his dad left, but, like, dude, there's nothing like showing that in the comics. Dane's just saying this stuff in his head. Right? And there's so much Dane, like, unless it's like proven, like, there's no way to know if any of that is actually true. And I wrote about that in The Realm War here, but just continuing on here. Like I wrote that his mother was human and his father was an elf. So Dane is half and half. So what's cool about Dane, and I think is cool about his character development here, is Dane is the first half human, half elf, like, written down. Like, I think, to me, that is a cool character arc. Like, the fact that Dane can be this only person that's, you know, half and half, and there's no other person like that. I think that's really cool. And obviously, Free Realms never goes into, like, like, interracial marriages, or they never go into that, like, having, like, hybrids of, like, having hybrids of different races and species and having kids like that. But I don't know if any Freemers here have seen the series Sweet Tooth. I think that show's super cool, and I think I kind of had inspiration from that to give Dane this character, this new character development, and I think it's super cool, man. I do. I really, really do. It's pretty neat. But anywho, let's keep going. He smiled and asked, "Let's find out then, shall we?" He reached out with his hand and placed it onto my head. It wasn't long before I realized that I couldn't move. I felt smaller and was in some sort of closet. I knew this closet, like it was one I had seen before. I tried to leave, but my body was locked in some sort of stasis. From this closet, I could see two people, much taller than I was, having an argument. From what I could gather, these were my parents. While I observed what was going on, I realized I didn't remember any of this. This was a moment in time that was foreign to me, and as a child, I probably suppressed everything that happened in this memory. After constant bickering between my parents, I heard my father say something of severe importance. I listened close, and he said, "Look, it won't be long before someone finds out about our family. Whether it be the elves or the pixies, I worry for the safety of our son." Then I heard my mother, and she said, "Let them find out. If not us, then Dane deserves to live a life that's free of fear, free of shame." Before either of them could say another word, there was a very loud knock on the door. My father went to answer the door, but he didn't get a chance to open it. Royal Pixies kicked the door wide open and placed my parents under arrest. I tried to do something, anything to help, but I was still unable to move. Another pixie flew in, and though I barely recognized her, it was Queen Ayani, Valerian's mother. I tried to listen in, and she said, "You two are hereby placed under arrest by the order of the Gleam Council. You both cross a line that they have deemed sickening." The Royal Pixies took them away, and I fought so hard to do something. And I want to point out here, so I wrote this in, saying that, you know, Ayani placed, there is kind of, how do I say this? It's not, like, stated anywhere, but, like, I don't think, considering Dane is, like, the first hybrid of, like, interspecies, like, it's not stated in Free Realms anywhere where, like, it's allowed or not to have a hybrid kid. But they've done it here. So, in my mind, because of how Sweet Tooth did its story and was like, hybrids are, like, you know, hybrids are the reason, like, the world ended, I kind of made Ayani the villain here. And basically, like, the Gleam Council deemed this, like, I think, for me personally, I wrote that, and I was like, Ayani's just using that as an excuse to arrest these two. Like, I don't know if even though I wrote it saying the Gleam Council had that order, I think Ayani just did it as an excuse to get rid of them. So I don't think the Gleam Council had a hand in doing anything. I think I wrote that, like, before. I wrote that before I finished the story, and I really didn't have an idea in mind of what the council could be. We're gonna get more into that later, but yeah, I think Ayani just like, you know, since it's the first time it happened, she found out about it. She wanted to get rid of both of them. So it's an interesting character arc for Dane to be the only hybrid, but again, I think like if you have watched Sweet Tooth, which by the way, I think it's 3 seasons long, such a good show. Like I think it was Netflix's last good show that came to Netflix, and it's so good. But yeah, like the stuff in Sweet Tooth, like, you know, hybrids are the reason the world ended. So to me, I thought, okay, well, Yanni might not like that this has happened. But anyway, yeah, that's why I wrote that in there. But anyway, let's keep going. In my struggle, I stumbled out of the closet for Yanni to find me. She kneeled down and said, "Don't worry, young one. We will watch over you and keep you safe. As long as you stay in line and keep to yourself, I'm sure we'll get along just fine." And then it hit me. That's why I ended up at the Royal Palace. Because of Ayani and the Royal Guard, I became an orphan. I don't even know if my parents are still alive, but I can find out through Valerian. Before the memory could continue further, I was immediately pulled out of the trance I was in by Luthias. So again, yeah, the reason Dane doesn't remember anything is because like those memories were suppressed. And that's the whole reason why he ended up at the Royal Palace with Valerian and all, like, crazy, I know. But crazy little story elevation is that, like, Dane didn't end up at the Royal Palace by accident. It was on purpose. Like, yeah, it's interesting. And also Valerian didn't mention anything about this because, like, it wasn't her doing it, was Ayani's. But like at this point, when writing this, I did actually like, I wrote it knowing that Valerian knew about everything that happened. So we'll get into that way later. But yeah, let's keep going. Once I snapped back to reality, Luthias smiled and said, "So, it's true. You are one of us. It was unfortunate to see what happened to your mother and father, but I am glad you made it here in one piece." I shook my head and said, "That's not important. What is important is putting me back in that time where I can ask Valerian where my parents are being held." He sighed and said, "I'm afraid I can't do that. My elven power only allows me to walk backwards through memories, not forwards." I sighed and said, "I need to know what happened to them. Regardless of what I am, they deserve to know I'm still alive." Luthias nodded and said, "I agree. Helping our cause can wait. Go, find your parents and tell Diane I miss him dearly." Or Dine. Yeah, Dine. "Tell Dine I miss him dearly." I nodded and immediately ran out of the room towards the exit of the building. Maya saw me leaving and asked, "Dane, where are you going?" I didn't answer and kept going. My mind was made up and I wasn't going to rest until I found my family. Luthias smiled and said, "You mustn't worry, Maya. I showed Dane his past and he decided to chase after it. Give him some space until he finds what he's looking for." Maya nodded and said, "When Dane is finished, I'll return to help as well." He nodded and said, "We wish you safe travels. We'll be waiting for you both to return." Maya departed and Chugsy looked at Luthias. He sighed and asked, "We'll need their help in order to see all of this through. How should we proceed?" Luthias smiled and said, "Carefully, my old friend. We will secure our future and ensure that Sacred Grove is broken from within." Okay, and that is chapter 6. We're moving on to chapter 7. So interesting about the comics is one thing I don't like about them is the fact that, like, obviously character development, but the storyline is so broken up. So like chapter 1 and 2, that's one story. It's kind of like how I did Samurai stories, and where every story was different, but they were all connected somehow. But the comics, like, they did those 2 chapters and then they moved on to a completely new story, which was saving Valerian. And then the next part, which I think it was like chapter 6, it like broke off into something new, or chapter 7 broke off into something new, with the Chaos Amulet, which, yeah, I mean, I don't like how they did that story. It felt so disconnected and broken up. Like, it didn't feel like it was one consistent thing. What's different here is everything is consistent. There is consistency to the Realm War. Like, I have chapter 7 is where we're going to take a bit of a turn, but I swear to God, it is a connected storyline through and through. So, without a further ado, let's get into chapter 7, Infiltrate. Getting into Briarwood wasn't an easy task. Ezra and Ludo went to search Thistle Row, which according to them was this maze full of secrets. By the way, this chapter is focusing on the Treebles from Sunrise Stories. So if you read Endure and Survive, I would say just read Endure if you wanted context on where this is. But like, this is where, like, in Endure, Chatty and all of the Treebles go through hardships, and they basically, their whole forest in Greenwood Forest is burnt to a crisp. And Chatty, Ezra, Ludo, and Jax are the only Treebles that survived. And how that story ended was basically they saw that Briarwood was the only forest that was untouched, and they wanted to go and investigate. And chapter 7 is basically continuing off of that story, but it is connecting to the Realm War. So, let's keep going. If that maze could give us the answers we sought, we'd finally be able to bring justice to those who wronged us and avenge the Treebles we lost. Jax and I, on the other side of Briarwood, decided to take to the vines of the forest and make our way into Darkthorn's palace. While on one of the vines, I looked below me and said, "Jax, I know we can fly, but I'd rather not go down there." He tilted his head and asked, "You're not afraid of heights, are you, Chatty?" I laughed and said, "Definitely not. I'd just rather avoid our neighbors down below, if it's all the same to you." He nodded and said, "Fair enough. We've still got a long way to go before we reach your palace." I looked ahead and asked, "Do you think the sister of the queen really knows anything about what happened to our home?" Jack shrugged and said, "If anyone would know, it's her. There were rumors about her poisoning Valerian, but it turned out to be a lie." I nodded and said, "I remember that. Royal advisor Joffrey was actually responsible, and it threw the entire royal family into chaos. That's when Darkthor cast aside her life in Sanctuary and started anew here in Briarwood." He set his hand on my shoulder and said, "So? That's why I think she might know what happened. Her activity in Briarwood is our only unknown in Sacred Grove. Let's find out what she knows." I nodded and we started making our way through the vines. After climbing through the roots of each and every tree in Briarwood, we arrived at the entrance of Darkthorn's defenses. Jax looked towards the Tanglewood Fort and saw an army of Chuggawugs standing by. He turned to me and asked, "I know half of the Chuggawugs followed Darkthorn to Briarwood because of what happened, but do you remember her having their whole species by her side?" I shook my head and said, "I can't say I do. Whatever's happening here cannot be good." Jack sighed and said, "So, she is up to something. I doubt we'd be able to stop whatever it is she's up to." I nodded and said, "That may be true, but we can still gather intel and find out what happened in Greenwood Forest." We made our way towards the palace and found a spot to perch in. We looked ahead, then saw a Chuggawug captain and Darkthorn together, having what looked like a serious conversation. As we watched them converse, Ezra and Ludo popped up behind us. They looked out of breath. So, I smiled and asked, "Did the maze give you guys trouble?" Ezra laughed and said, "More trouble than it was worth. We didn't find anything other than security keeping the maze locked down." Ludo looked at Jax and asked, "I take it your lead dried up as well?" Jax shook his head and said, "We found Darkthorn and her captain having a discussion. I believe we should eavesdrop if we want to gather any sort of information." I looked below and said, "I agree. let's get justice for our kind and find out what happened in Greenwood Forest. But yeah, so basically, Chatty and the three Treebles, they literally just want information on what happened in Greenwood Forest. So the four of them are basically going on the same journey that Dane and Maya are, in a way. Like, they're also getting information. They also, like, you know, they want to know what happened. And that's kind of like they're on the same journey that Dane and Maya are on, kind of, which is, I think, pretty interesting for a storyline. And it's why I include the Treebles in in the Realm War, because, and even in Samurai Stories, because the Treebles are like, there's no real lore to them, like, at all. So I really wanted to, like, try my best to include them in the story. Like, I didn't like, they're pretty much a main part of the whole thing, but like they're not, I don't have them doing too much, you know, because it's kind of hard to write Treebles into the lore. But anyway, I digress. I'm gonna drink some water before we keep going. All right. With our heightened hearing, we listened to Darkthorn and the Chugawug captain. Darkthorn sighed and said, "Are the preparations in place, Chugug?" Chugug nodded and said, "We've got eyes in Sanctuary. Most of the Chugawugs rally to our cause." She glared at him and asked, "Most? Not all?" Cleared his throat and said, "My son, despite my best efforts, has been a thorn in our side. He preaches peace and unity just so our kind can become lazy and Wugachug." By the way, context. Junior is the son of Chugug. If you guys read Samurai Stories, you'll know that in Lineage, I think it was Lineage, I'm pretty sure, Junior's story is kind of expanded upon in that story, but also Junior is friends with Dane. While I don't have them linking up in the Realm War, what Junior did was kind of important, because he basically, like, he got some Chugawugs to back off of fighting, and just being peaceful. So that's kind of, it's kind of a little nod to, like, hey, you know, these people have moved on. But yeah, a lot of characters in the comics are not returning in the Realm War, but I did include a lot of them, so, or I tried to anyway. But anyway, I digress. Let's keep going. Also, I do realize, like, Dane there was an elf in the comics. It was like, what was his name? His name was what was it, Elvis? And the thing is, I don't think, I want to believe that Dane didn't realize he was actually an elf, and like I think Dane should, like, you know, be oblivious to that kind of thing. But I do think the first time that Dane and Maya have seen an elf was in Silver Hills. Like, there's no, I feel like Elvis it was such a weird character for them to throw in there, and I didn't, like, I'm not including it into the lore that I wrote here because, I don't know, I feel like Dane and Maya discovering elves for the first time in Silver Hills is more appropriate than than how the comics did it, because it was like, it was so out of left field. But anyway, I digress. Let's keep going. She sighed and said, "We cannot have another failure. I refuse to be second to Valerian and lose my place here in Sacred Grove." He sighed and said, "This time is different. We have more resources, more of my kind by our side, and no dock cheat to screw things up." She turned to Chugug and said, "That fool let his own power consume him. He unleashed these gloam creatures, burned down forests, and put the entire grove to sleep, all for what? To let it all go to his head." He nodded and said, It's unfortunate that he won't be here to see us take over Sacred Grove. Then again, he wouldn't be able to keep control over Sanctuary." She chuckled and said, "You're not wrong. Still, enough is enough. My sister has been in power for far too long. Let's get back to work. What we overheard shocked us. Shocked me straight to my core. I turned to look back at all three of them and said, I can't believe it. She orchestrated the whole thing. She's the reason we're the last of our species. Jax sighed and said, she may have been planning to take over Sacred Grove, but she didn't burn down her forests. Someone named Darkcheat did, and it sounds like he's gone. I shook my head and asked, why are you taking her side? We came here for justice, and you're trying to justify her actions? He shrugged and said, no. She's still somewhat at fault for starting all of this. What I am saying is we need to think our next move through. I turned back towards the palace and said, we've done enough thinking. It's time for action. Before I could jump down below after Darkthorn, Ezra grabbed me by the tail and pulled me back into the branches. I looked at him and asked, what are you doing? He sighed and said, we can't lose you too, Chatty. We need to think before we act here. And besides, we're Treebles. We can't do anything to Darkthorn or her army. I stood back up, looked at Ludo and asked, so what do you think we should do? Sit around and do nothing? He shook his head and said, not only do we know what she did back then, we know what she's planning. We need to give this information to someone. Jax tilted his head and asked, give it to who? Last I checked, no one knows we survived, and they might start asking questions. They might even throw us in a cell where we're never seen again. Ezra nodded and said, he's got a point, Ludo. It's easier said than done, and we're running out of options. We're running out of people to trust. Ludo looked at me and asked, so we can't trust Valerian? Robbie? Anyone in Sacred Grove with a pulse? I shrugged and said, Ludo, you know that Robbie and I have been at odds for years. As for Valerian, a part of me wonders why she didn't put a stop to all of this. Maybe she didn't have a choice, or she let it happen. Either way, I don't want to risk our safety until we can find someone who we trust. We're on our own. So, we left Briarwood and never looked back. If there was someone out there who we could trust, they would need to have the courage to save Sacred Grove. Okay, so, hold on one second. I'm going to edit something here. It's easy. It's easy edit. I think. I shouldn't have to do too much. I really shouldn't, and I'm not going to, but I'm going to fix little things here and there. So, this, that chapter, like, super important for the character development of the Treebles. They're going to play an important role later. But these next few chapters are going to be kind of bouncing back and forth between characters. So that chapter was, chapter 6 was Dane and Maya, obviously continuing that whole interaction in Silver Hills. Chapter 7, all about the Treebles. Chapter 8 here is going to be about Dane. I believe chapter 9 jumps to Maya. It's kind of, for the most part, there's a lot of jumps. So I just want to point that out, just in case anyone gets a little confused. But I'm going to drink some water. We'll continue this. All right. It's chapter 8, Rebirth. Because obviously, the title there, I'm not going to go behind every single title that I did here, but like, I will talk about them. Rebirth is referring to Dane finding out that he's a hybrid, you know? And it's important character development here, but let's go. I stopped in my tracks near Snow Hill. After storming out of Silver Hills, I started to realize that my parents might not even be alive. It didn't occur to me until now that I'm probably chasing ghosts. I felt defeated and sat down in the snow, next to some building I didn't even feel like looking at. As clear as it was in the sky, it started snowing. That's when I started to tear up, because I never felt more lost than I am right now. Then, suddenly, I heard a door open behind me. I turned around, saw my Uncle Frederick, and he asked, Dane? It's really coming down out there. Or coming down out here. Why don't you come inside? And I just want to point something out here. Dane's uncle, never named. Like, he's just like, my uncle. There was never a name given to his uncle. And I wanted to include him in part of the story because he gives Dane important background here that's very important for the story going forward. But, it's interesting because, like, you know, his uncle's the only family he really had. Even in the comics, I pulled from that to include his uncle, but he's the only family Dane has ever had. So I wanted to give his uncle some more story besides mentioning him, you know. But yeah, let's keep going. I didn't even know my uncle's bakery was here in Snow Hill. It took me a minute, but I gathered myself and said, "Uncle, I guess I'll take you up on that offer, but we should talk." He smiled and said, "Of course." I stepped into his shop and it looked just like I remembered when I was a kid. He looked at me and said, "Make yourself at home, kid. We got a lot to discuss, judging by the tears in your eyes." I nodded and took a seat in a booth. After Luthius returned my memories to me, I started to think about the time I spent with my uncle. Just by looking around the place, I felt like I took all of that for granted. He walked in from the other room, sat down and asked, "So, what's on your mind, kiddo?" I chuckled and asked, "You do know that I'm not a kid anymore, right?" He sighed and said, "The last time that I saw you was when you were 12 years old, doing odd jobs for Valerian. So you're still a kid to me." I nodded and said, "I'm sorry, Uncle. I should have at least called to check up on you." He shrugged and said, "And it's water under the bridge. You're here now, and that's what matters. So, catch me up on what's been going on." I sighed, then looked at him and asked, "Did you know?" He tilted his head and asked, "Did I know what? About what?" I cleared my throat and asked, "Did you know about what happened to my parents?" He sighed and said, "Yeah, I did." I crossed my arms and asked, "Why didn't you say anything?" He looked out the window and said, "To protect you." Tilting my head and asked, "To protect me from what?" He sighed and said, "When I found out that your father and my sister had been taken into custody, I rushed over to the royal palace." And I want to preface this because when you think of like an uncle, it's usually a family member of, or a relative, or sorry, sibling of another person in the family. And I figured, well, if Dane's father is an elf, then Dane's mother has to be human. And if Dane has an uncle, it's got to be someone in Sacred Grove, right? But yeah, just wanted to write that in there because it makes a lot of sense, right? And besides, in the comics, like Dane's mother stayed with Dane and his mother stayed with their uncle, so to me it made a lot of sense to write that in there. But anyway, let's keep going. My eyes widened and I asked, "You were there?" He nodded and said, "I was, but I was there too late. When I tried to get into the palace, I was stopped by both the royal guards and Iani herself." I slammed my fist on the table and said, "I should have done something." He shook his head and said, "Hey, you were just a kid. You couldn't really do much, even if you tried." I nodded and asked, "What happened next?" He cleared his throat and said, "I tried getting answers. I even tried to get them released. That's when I was threatened by Iani. She said if I continued to ask questions or burst into the palace, I would suffer the same fate or worse." I thought for a moment and asked, "So how was I able to visit you?" He pulled something out of his wallet, then handed it to me and said, "Iani and I made an agreement. If I didn't say anything about your parents to you or anyone else, I'd be allowed to have you come by the bakery that was in Sanctuary. She gave me that pass and the guards would let me through. Still keep it close, just as a reminder." I handed him back the pass and asked, "You said was. This place looks just like I remember, but it occurred to me that there was never snow around your shop. Why did you move it here?" He sighed and said, "It didn't feel right doing business in Sanctuary. The gods were constantly watching my every move, and I didn't have any privacy. If I'm being really honest," dude, I keep messing this up, bro. I thought I got them all, but apparently I didn't. Alright, back to it. "If I'm being really honest, I just need to get away from it all." I chuckled and said, "I understand that. I tried to step away from the Grove, but I ended up getting pulled back into everything." He nodded and said, "So, now you know everything that's happened since you were a kid." I sighed and said, "Well, now I need to find my parents." He stood up and said, "Dane, as much as I want to see my sister and brother-in-law again, it's been 18 years. No one has seen them since they were taken." I shook my head and said, "That might not be true. If anyone has seen them, it'd be Valerian." He sighed and asked, "The daughter of Ayani? Even if she did know, what are the odds she'd tell you anything, let alone allow you back into the palace?" I shrugged and said, "Well, with the way she's been acting lately, the chances are very low. Still, I don't care. One way or another, I'm getting some answers." He sat back down and said, "Dane, use your head, even if it's not screwed on properly. Valerian has an army defending the palace. Your parents haven't been seen in years. You are just one being against everyone in a world of unknowns. It's not worth losing yourself to all of that. I think it's time to accept the fact that they're gone." I tried to hold back my tears, but I couldn't. So through them, I took a deep breath and said, "Maybe you're right. They're probably gone. It's impossible to know what happened to them. Because of who I am, I need to know. If it means I'll die trying to learn the truth, then so be it." In that moment, I left my uncle and his bakery. While we still weren't completely on the same page, I could tell he cared a lot about my parents and my well-being. Despite our differences, he taught me something that I couldn't teach myself. Even if I wanted to, I can't confront Valerian on my own. Maya and I wouldn't be enough to get past her defenses. If we want to get through, we'll need a team. Okay, so, I was wrong about where Chapter 9 is going, because now I remember. So Chapter 9 is still Dane. I think Chapter 10 is where it jumps to Maya. I could be wrong, though, but... Yeah, I need some water, because... Dude. Listen, you guys... This was the hardest... Like, this was hard to write, but it's also hard to, like, continuously talk about all of this. And obviously, like... Oh, man, it's a lot. But, yeah, so we're going to move on to Chapter 9, Essence. So, from here on out, Dane and Maya are going to basically build a team together. Kind of, but they're, like, kind of separated at the moment, so... But yeah, this is where a lot of building is going to happen, in terms of, like, story building and character building. But yeah, let's get into Chapter 9, Essence. It didn't take me too long to figure out a plan. I decided to make my way towards Briarwood in the hopes I could ask Darkthorn for some help. By the way, Dane doesn't know anything about what Darkthorn did. Like, she has no idea that Darkthorn, or he has no idea that Darkthorn was involved in any of this. So, I don't even know if, I don't remember if I even brought it up that, if I wrote about it, that Darkthorn was... Like, obviously I did in the Treble chapter, but, like, I don't remember if I had Dane, like, learn about it, but, I might have. I don't remember. I wrote a lot. It's a lot to remember, dude. But anyway, let's keep going. I know she doesn't see eye to eye with her sister, but she does care for her in some way. I stood in front of the entrance to Briarwood and realized that it had been a while since I last entered the region. It was quiet when I started walking in. It was the kind of quiet you hear in the dead of night, when no one is around, but there's always something lurking in the darkness. I got further in and started to hear something I hadn't heard in Briarwood before. I turned to see a construction crew working on something deeper in the forest. I was about to walk over to see what they were doing, but then I heard a voice whisper to me. I turned around and he said, "Hey, Brawler, get over here." I quickly made my way over and asked, "What's going on over there?" He had a hood on, but looked towards the construction and said, "I've been watching this crew for weeks now. They're rebuilding the track that used to be here before the Glum invasion." I looked at him and asked, "You were there? During the whole thing?" He tilted his head and asked, "Not the whole thing, but I was there for enough. You weren't?" I shook my head and said, "By the time I heard the rumblings, I was fast asleep." He took off his hood and said, "As much as I want to remain hidden, I should introduce myself. My name is Cale Yardbird, but I doubt that name means anything to a brawler like yourself." I thought for a moment and said, "Yardbird? You crushed almost every Sacred Grove record on the tracks, all around the map. It's hard to forget a living legend like yourself." So yeah, if you guys don't know who Cale Yardbird is, you need to do your lore research, man. Yardbird is basically, trying to think. Yardbird, I'm stupid. Cale Yardbird is a character from Sunrise Stories, and he's in the story Burnout. Burnout is the longest story I wrote in Sunrise Stories because I was so inspired to write it. And there was a lot of like racing art from TCG, and I thought, I'll write a very cool story, and I did. And Yardbird is gonna, he's gonna play Cale, I guess. Cale is gonna play a huge role in the Realm War. Huge. Well, I say huge, but he plays a pivotal role in this whole thing. But yeah, man. I really wanted Cale to be in the story, and I wanted there to be I wanted Dane to be the first one he meets. But yeah, it's gonna be a very good story with Cale entering the picture, because he's no longer a racer anymore. Because if you remember Burnout, there's a reason Cale is no longer a racer, and we're gonna kind of explore that here. But yeah, I thought I'd talk about that because having Cale enter the picture is super neat. And yeah, I just really wanted to introduce him to the story, because that was a story I liked writing in Sunrise Stories. Like, I really enjoyed writing that. But anywho, let's keep going. He looked at me and asked, "You sound like a racer. What's your name?" I smiled and said, "Dane Kensington III. I've won a few races here and there, but not in the ways that you have." He chuckled and said, "Well, those days are unfortunately behind me. I took warrior classes and moved on. It was for the best." I tilted my head and asked, "I get wanting another job. It's why I became a brawler as well, but why would you give up being a racer?" And Cale's going to go into detail here, but yeah, I basically made I made Cale into a warrior, which I think suits him. And there's a reason why I made him a warrior, because I had a whole plan when writing this. Like, I had a whole notepad of ideas and stuff I wanted to do with characters, stuff I wanted to write down. It's a whole thing. But anyway, let's keep going. He sighed and said, "It's a long story, but for the most part, I blame Valerian." I nodded and said, "Don't we all? She's been causing problems for a lot of people lately." He shrugged and said, "It's less of a problem she caused for me and more of a life-changing experience." He stood there, silent, for just a moment. He cleared his throat and said, "I won't give you the full story. It'll just bring up bad memories from the past." I nodded and said, "It's all good. No need to overwhelm yourself, like I have in the past." He smiled and said, "Valerian started to drive decided to start a new way of driving a car. She called it crash racing, essentially bringing racing and demolition derby together into one form of competition. By the way, just in case no one has actually read Samurai Stories and doesn't know that story well, I do kind of retrace steps here, and like I give you a synopsis of, you know, a Cliff Notes version of what that story was, you know? Anyway, let's keep going. I gasped and said, "That sounds chaotic. I can't say I'd participate in that, considering how crazy racing is already." He nodded and said, "It was. Everyone I knew in the scene was competing, and I even saw some new faces. Those new faces, though, slowly faded when I saw two demo derby elites." I looked over at the construction work and asked, "Let me guess. The demo derby elites are the ones rebuilding the track over here." He nodded and said, "They're the reason I'm here. They want to bring crash racing to here and Black Spore." What did I do here? Frick, man. Frickin' frick. Hold on. Bro, I literally am dumb. Fix. I need to stop looking at that, dude. They want to bring crash racing to here in Black Spore. It got shut down after the first race. I tilted my head at him and asked, "Shut down? You mean it's not going to continue?" He shrugged and said, "For good reason. Those two demolitionists ruined it. They sent a kid that I just met into the hospital, and I learned after the race that he lost the ability to walk." I sighed and asked, "How's he doing now?" He shook his head and said, "He died a few months ago. He drifted off into a coma and never woke up." So yeah, if you haven't read Burnout basically, two racers died basically in that story, and yeah, it's kind of an it's a really good story. I liked writing that one. But yeah, this kid Alex Driftbreak, he literally he got sent to the hospital, and he was in a coma basically. But yeah, it's a whole thing. It's a whole thing, man. Go and read it. Go and read the story. I don't want to like talk about it too much, but like go and read it. It's good. Trust me. I frowned and said, "He should have had a real chance to race." He smiled and said, "His name was Alex. Took real guts for him to enter that race." And then he started to tear up and said, "They took her away from me. Allie and I were gonna be together, and they took that away from us. She died in a vehicle explosion, and there was nothing left of her or the car." I sighed and said, "That's not fair. To take away a future from someone is to rip their soul from their body." He nodded and said, "They took everything from me, Dane. I can't let them do the same to anyone else." I looked at the track and asked, "Let me help. What can we do to put a stop to their production?" He smiled and said, "If you want something done right, you've got to do it yourself. If you're willing to help, we need to take down the track. Permanently." I thought for a moment and said, "All right, if that's what needs to be done." It looks like they're going on a lunch break. We should strike while the iron's hot. We pull... Goodness gracious, man. My throat's killing me, bro. It's a lot to read, though. Like, it is. Okay. Whew. We pulled out our weapons and started tearing the track apart. I could see in Kale's eyes that he was hurting, and he was using this as a way of getting it out of his system. The crew didn't get far with the track, and it didn't take a lot of time to undo their work. Kale, out of breath, looked at the track and said, "That'll teach them not to ruin more lives. At least I hope it will." I shrugged and said, "Some people never change, but I hope so too." As we were about to leave, two people stood on the hill above us, and one of them asked, "What do you two think you're doing?" Kale looked at him and said, What does it look like, Ringa? We're taking matters into our own hands. And also, I just want to point out, at the end of Burnout, Kale did actually, like, say he was going to back off of, like, racing and just leave everything alone. But I thought about that, and I kind of rewrote it here as Kale couldn't let what happened to Alex and Allie go. Like, he couldn't. Like, he just couldn't. he couldn't let them get away with what they did. So he went back on his word a little bit here. Well, a little bit. He did go back on his word here, and he's sabotaging them. But anyway, let's keep going. What does it look like, Ringa? We're taking matters into our own hands. I looked up at them and asked, are those the guys that started building this thing? He nodded and said, Rip Ringa and Burt Wrecking Crew. If anything, they're another reason I quit racing. Ringa looked at me and said, you getting caught up in the wrong battle here, brawler. I chuckled and said, my name is Dane, and I'm right where I belong. He chuckled and said, is that so? Well, you can join Yardbird here in the Black Spore Graveyard when we're through with you. I smiled, then lowered my mallet close to the floor and said, you know, for some demo derby dudes, you're not all that smart. He grinned and asked, what makes you so sure of yourself? I pointed to our weapons and said, you two aren't outnumbered, but you're definitely outmatched. Kale isn't just a racer anymore. He's a warrior. If you think you've got us beat, then you've got another thing coming. Without hesitation, Kale and I rushed the two of them and swung as hard as we could. Kale hit Ringa so hard that he went flying against the track we just tore apart. I hit Burt with all of my might and knocked him unconscious against scrap metal. I looked at Kale and said, I've got your back, every step of the way. He shook my hand and said, thank you for everything. I don't think I would have gotten this far without your support. Rip spat out blood from his mouth and said, you're gonna wish you didn't cross me. Kale looked down the hill and said, quiet down. You don't get to threaten me after what we just did to you two. He coughed and said, it doesn't matter. Even if nothing happens with these tracks we're trying to build, we'll rally with Darkthorn in the end. I tilted my head and went down the hill and asked, Darkthorn? What is she planning? He chuckled and said, wouldn't you like to know, Pipsqueak? Still, since you asked, I'll oblige, considering you earned it. Oh, here we go. Yes, I did write this down. Good, very good. Introducing Dane to the actual Darkthorn. Because the way they wrote Darkthorn in the comics, it's so weird because, you know, obviously, like she retreated back to her. You know, she went to Briarwood, but the way they wrote Darkthorn is so like. It's almost like they don't know what character they want Darkthorn to be in the comics. Like, they write her all over the place because Darkthorn is either a villain or a hero. Like, she's an anti-hero almost, or an anti-villain. And I'm like, I don't like that. Like, dude, if you're gonna make a villain a villain, stop making anti-villains or anti-heroes or whatever. I think it's stupid. But regardless, the way I wrote Darkthorn, I think, is the correct way to write her, not the way they were trying to, which is, I don't know, man. Super weird. But anywho, let's keep going. He looked towards her palace and said, from what I've heard, she's going to take over the old grove by force. It's how she's going to do it that is a secret locked up tight. So, I'll stick with her over trying to relive the glory days. Kale walked over to Ringa and said, we're even now. Rest easy, knowing I'll be keeping the grove safe from people like you. He rolled his eyes and passed out. I shook my head and asked, why is it so hard to be a decent human being? Kale shrugged and said, Dane, I've been asking myself that same question ever since that day on the track. I looked at Kale and asked, how would you like to join me? Maybe save the grove with one swing at a time? Kale smiled and said, I'd be happy to. Anything to be rid of people like them. Before I could say another word, someone shouted from the hilltop and said, Dane, is that you? Oh, did I not freaking... God, man. Dude, I literally... Just context, I revised this entire thing before I started writing again. And holy crap, I thought I got everything. Apparently I didn't. It's kind of annoying. I turned around to see Vittorio and said, "Long time no see." He laughed and said, "By the gods, you've aged." I chuckled and said, "You have too, old man." He smiled and asked, "Who's your friend?" Kale chuckled and said, "Kale Yardbird's my name, but saving the grove is now my game." He jumped around enthusiastically and said, "Excellent, that's just what we're looking for." I tilted my head and asked, "We?" He started walking back up the hill and said, "Do you remember Meyhold? If you do, we're in the midst of a battle in Greenwood Forest, and we need all the help we can get." I thought for a moment and said, "That sounds pretty important, so I guess I can't say no." Kale nodded and said, "Count me in as well. Anything to put a stop to a battle." Vittorio smiled and said, "Follow me. I'll explain what's going on when we get there." We marched up the hill and left the two demo derby dudes in the dust. Kale looked back for a second and said, "Alex? Allie? It's okay now. You don't have..." Frick, man. It's every time. Every time I look... Bro, did someone edit these without me noticing, bro? I swear. We're only going to be viewing. Okay. "Alex, Allie, it's okay now. You don't have to worry about me anymore. I'll see you both soon." With the sun rising, we made our way to Greenwood Forest. So, chapter 10, which we are going to be reading here, because I did say we were doing 5 chapters per episode here, per part, I guess. But this chapter is going to be going into Maya's point of view, but also going into another point of view. I guess like 2 chapters are kind of colliding here a little bit, but let's get into it. Chapter 10. Actually, I'm going to hold on. I am going to drink water for a second, so give me a moment. Kind of important that I do. All right. Okay, let's get into it. Chapter 10, Guidance. With Dane going off on his own, I decided to venture off to Shrouded Glade. I didn't expect him to leave so suddenly. He didn't even bother to ask me if I wanted to tag along. Despite my frustration at him for doing what he did, I was used to being alone. The last time I was in Shrouded Glade was when Dane and I went looking for the Chaos Amulet. By the way, Chaos Amulet. Just keep that in mind. I'm not going to say anything more, just keep that in mind. One part of me wondered how much the place had changed since then. Another part of me wondered if it was right to go there, without Dane by my side. He kept me steady when life suddenly decided to throw me off balance. I wish I could say it was something I appreciated him doing for me. After being in my own head for way too long, I didn't even notice that I had arrived in Shrouded Glade. Surprisingly, it looked pretty different since I had last been here. I looked around and saw the main academy building in ruins. Everything around the area was shattered, like something destroyed this place on purpose. I sighed and asked, what could have caused all this to happen? I heard someone fly right beside me, then they sighed and said, "Not what? Who?" I turned around to see Maple Sugarleaf, the head sorcerer of Shrouded Glade. I cleared my throat and asked, "One person did all this?" She nodded and said, "Yes, Maya. His name was Baron von Darkcheat. He trained here, and in the end, he destroyed this place." I looked at the academy ruins and asked, "This Baron, was he a dwarf?" She sighed and said, "Yes, he was the dwarf that started the Glum invasion." I sighed and said, "I assumed as much. I've seen what his power is capable of." Maple looked at me and said, "You have? Then you know nothing could stop him." I shook my head and asked, "You could have, Maple?" Yeah. Why didn't you? She sighed and said, what Dark Cheat was harnessing was not what we taught. I don't know who taught him how to use dark sorcery, but he didn't teach himself that. Even with what I had learned at the time, it wouldn't have been enough to stop him. So, context for Maple Sugarleaf being in the story. Because it's kind of a random character to throw in, right? But there is relevance here. Maple Sugarleaf was the headmaster of Strataglade back in Luck of the Draw. And she's the one who, like allowed Dark Cheat to be there in Strataglade. So, the reason I have her in the story is because she knew Dark Cheat. Like, and I guess, like, you know, Maple did know what happened during that time in Luck of the Draw, but she wasn't a prominent character in Luck of the Draw, so I didn't, like, make her a huge character in the Realm War here. She's just in this chapter. Like, that's it. She's not in any other part of this story, but anywho, let's keep going. I looked at the academy and asked, did you even try? She looked at me in anger, then quickly calmed down and said, Baron set one of the students on fire. He didn't survive. I expelled him from the academy, and shortly after, I took my leave from the academy. I tilted my head and asked, you went on leave? She nodded and said, I needed to find out where Dark Cheat got his power from and how to put it out like a flame. Unfortunately, even after traveling throughout the grove, I had no answers. That's when I returned to see this. She pointed to the academy and sat down silently. I looked at her and asked, if there was someone just as powerful as Dark Cheat, or even worse, would we have a fighting chance? She looked up at me, shook her head, and said, we would be doomed. I sighed and said, I came here looking for direction. I feel like I'm all alone in a coming fight, and I thought Strataglade was the place where I could find hope. She looked at me and said, hope is always fleeting, Maya. If you're looking for it, the Sacred Garden is the only thing that Dark Cheat didn't destroy. I looked towards it and asked, how is it still standing? She shrugged and said, fate works in mysterious ways. I think it still serves a purpose and will be here until it's no longer needed. Maple seemed lost, like she knew everything and nothing at the same time. Maybe she's right where she's supposed to be, watching over what remains of Strataglade. I flew over to the garden that she had mentioned and realized that this was my first time visiting the place. So, like, this garden that's in Strataglade, I feel like I didn't, like, in Luck of the Draw, I feel like I didn't explore a lot of Strataglade that I could have. So that's why I have this written like I do. So I just wanted to point that out for you guys. Just, like, I wanted to add another area to Strataglade that might have been there and just was untouched. But, yeah, let's keep going. I looked around and saw nothing but plant life. Wait. Oh, frick. Is that... No. Why did I capitalize that? That's just a little thing. Okay. I looked around and saw nothing but plant life thriving in the garden. It was like all of the vines protected everything from harm. It made me wonder if this was how the garden stayed safe after all of these years. I flew in and saw multiple boulders scattered throughout the garden. I didn't know what to make of them until I saw 4 treebles near one of the boulders. So this is what I meant by the chapters are kind of colliding here. Maya and the treebles are going to work together here, kind of like how Dane and Kale are working together. And eventually, all of these characters are going to collide. Eventually. I promise. I promise. But we got to get further into the story here. So let's keep going. I flew over and asked, what's with the rocks? One of them looked at me and said, we're a bit lost, to say the least. These guide stones are supposed to help those who can't help themselves. I sighed and said, sadly, I'm a bit lost myself. Being alone doesn't help, and on top of that, I have this feeling that I'm supposed to save the world. He turned back to the stone and said, times are tough, especially for us. I tilted my head and asked, why's that? He looked at the other 3 Treebles and said, we're all that's left. Ever since the Glum invasion, no other Treeble has been found. I frowned and said, I'm sorry, I didn't know. If I had known, I wouldn't have made our conversation all about my struggles. He shook his head and said, it's not your burden to carry. Even though they won't let me take it, the blame is mine. And this is Chatty talking, by the way, in case you guys were curious about who's talking, but it is brought up here in a second. Just wanted to point that out. I knelt down and asked, I don't understand. Why are you to blame? He sighed and said, I ran and hid while all of the Treebles met an unavoidable fate. I tried to save them, but instead of being a hero, I became a coward. I smiled and said, you did what you thought was right at the time. Your friends survived and they helped guide you along the way. You're here now and that's what matters. He nodded and said, as true as that might be, it still doesn't make up for what I did. I tilted my head and asked, what was this unavoidable fate you mentioned? He looked at his friends, then back to me and asked, can I trust you? I thought for a moment and said, trust is a complicated thing. I had a hard time trusting others until someone showed me how to. If there's anyone you can learn to trust, it's the ones closest to you. He thought for a moment and said, all right, I'll tell you, but I need you to do something for me. I flew up from the ground and asked, what do you need me to do? He pointed to a large guide stone and said, approach the guide stone and close your eyes. Don't say anything, but think about where you want to go, and maybe it will guide you. I knelt down once again and took a deep breath. I thought about Valerian, Dane, Morningstar, and the journey to come. I thought about my family as well, if they're still out there. I thought about everything I've been through and everything I'm going to go through from this point on. And then I exhaled, letting all of that stress and frustration go. The Treeble smiled and said, it's not easy letting the guide stone take over. I shook my head and said, it felt necessary. I needed that. He nodded and said, now, with that out of the way, I'd like to introduce myself and my friends. He startled his friends and pointed to me. He cleared his throat and said, allow me to introduce my friends. This here's Ludo, over here is Ezra, and this fluffy guy is Jax. I smiled and asked, what's your name? He turned to me and said, you can call me Chatty. I gasped and said, I knew I recognized you. The Sacred Grove mascot, alive and well. So, funny enough, Maya does actually know. So, introducing Chatty into lore is really, it's difficult because Chatty is like the mascot of Free Realms, and I did it pretty well in Samurai Stories, but here I was like, okay, well, people do have to know who Chatty is, right? Maya does know Chatty. Just knowing that he's the mascot and all, but anyway, let's keep going. He sighed and said, I'm not doing a very good job of keeping that reputation, though. Ludo scoffed and said, oh, hush, Chatty. You stand here for everything good about Treeble kind, regardless of our current circumstances. I nodded and said, Still, it's nice to meet you all properly. My name is Maya, in case you were wondering. Chatty smiled and said, it's nice to meet you, Maya. Now, down to how we got here in the first place. And this image right here, it's throwing back to Endure. So, in case anyone was wondering. He sighed and said, as hard as it is to explain, this huge purple flame overtook Greenwood Forest and left us wondering where it came from or who could have caused it. I thought for a moment and said, Well, Dark Cheat does come to mind. From what Maple told me, he could harness power that no one else could. Jax nodded and said, he's the one who caused it, that's for sure. However, it seems Darkthorn was behind the whole thing. I tilted my head and asked, Darkthorn? Why would she do something like that, considering how much she cares about Valerian? And again, I am kind of addressing Darkthorn's previous character in the comics, in this a little bit, because I feel like we still need to address like how Darkthorn acts, and I feel like she's kind of a character you can't read, you know? But anyway, let's keep going. Ezra shook his head and said, because we went to Briarwood, we overheard a conversation between her and her right hand. Not only did they confirm our suspicions, but we also learned that they're planning to take over Sacred Grove. I sighed and asked, I guess I was wrong about her. So, we can't let her do that. As much as I don't trust Valerian, Darkthorn is worse. Chatty looked at me and asked, so, what do you suggest we do? I thought for a moment and said, we need to find my friend, Dane, then work together to put a stop to Darkthorn and her plan. Jax nodded and said, now that's a good suggestion. We'll need a team to take down her and her army. I chuckled and said, an army? We'll work our way there, but let's stick to finding Dane. The sooner we find him, the sooner we can bring peace to Sacred Grove. All four of them nodded and followed me out of Shrouded Glade. Before I left, Maple turned to me and asked, did you find what you were looking for? I nodded and said, it took some time, but I think I know where I'm headed. She smiled and said, that's good. I think I'll stay here for a while. Shrouded Glade needs me, and I need it. And I need it. I didn't really know what she meant by that, but I left her to the ruins of the Academy. I stepped out of Shrouded Glade with a newfound purpose. That purpose was our team and reclaiming Sacred Grove. And that's where we're going to end the video here, because these videos are getting long, but we're doing 5 chapters per video. But yeah, thank you guys for watching. If you did, as always, I appreciate it a ton. And I will see you guys in the next video. And yeah, goodbye.